Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine in the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this podcast topic is ADP 313 Writing Team Talks, focusing on the recent publication of ADP 313 Information. We welcome back to the show Lieutenant Colonel Retired Chuck Schrankel and Lieutenant Colonel Retired Mike Flynn. They are both part of the Command and Control Division here at CADD and were instrumental in the publishing of ADP 313. Chuck is a retired artillery officer and the division chief of the Command and Control Division. He was the team leader for the writing of ADP 313. Mike is a retired infantry officer and was the single pen author of ADP 313. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa.
Hello, Lisa.
So ADP 313 is a brand new Army publication, and that has generated a lot of buzz here in the CADD hallways because usually doctrine authors at CADD are just updating, revising, and editing previous editions of doctrine. So it's much harder to find doctrine authors who start from scratch on a publication. So I'd kind of like to start from there. So Chuck, could you give us how the ideas came to be, how they were generated, what guidance that you got that started this off, this publication?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that influenced the writing of this manual, and this is kind of my version of history. So for anybody that's listening out there, this is I think I have it close, but it may not be exact. But I think it all goes back to 2017 when Joint Doctrine introduced the information joint function, and that kind of started this journey where the entire joint force is trying to figure out how they're going to deal with information in future OEs. I know they kicked off concept writing between Army and Joint, and they were writing something called the Concept for Operations in the Information Environment circa 2018 and 2019. And then in 2020, there was just a whole lot of work that went on. The Army started to run a series of meetings called Army Campaign Plan 2028, and that was several working groups that were trying to figure out how the Army was going to operate from 2028 on. That subsequently morphed into Army 2030, but LOE 5 in that mess was information, and Mike Flynn sat in on that most of the time, trying to figure out how was the Army going to deal with information and doctrine and in operations. We also had the draft of JP 304, which the Joint folks started, the staff information
In joint
operations. Thank you, sir. And we also had the first draft of FM30, which was going to operationalize multi-domain operations. The other thing that happened in 2020 is Cyber COE basically ran a force mod assessment and identified like 33 gaps that were kind of information related or in the information realm. And they came up here, the CCOE commander, I think, and his seated folks came up here in like August of 2020 and kind of pitched the idea called information warfare to the CADD commander at the time. And the CADD commander gave some guidance and we broke for a day or so and kind of came up with a big idea and some lines of effort to support this big idea. Again, the overarching idea was information warfare, and it had 5 supporting, at the time they were called information advantage activities underneath it. They worked on that for a while, and then the CADD commander called a 3-star information forum here at Leavenworth in February of 2021. And several of the Army senior leaders came here. They discussed this for about 2 days, and we had several decisions that came out of that forum. The first was that we were going to use kind of a different OE model than the rest of the Army's going to use, and I think Mike's going to talk about that in a little bit. That we, in fact, were not going to have information as a function because that's kind of been going back and forth for a while now, and that we were not going to use information warfare as the big idea. The big idea was going to be information advantage. And the reason we didn't use information warfare is there are some folks in the Army that didn't like the term warfare in relation to things that you're doing during competition and crisis. And then there's kind of pedantic people out there that talk about joint doctrine only says there's kind of 2 types of warfare, I think traditional and irregular, and we don't need to be adding stuff to it. So those were the big decisions. The other decision was that we're going to write a book. on information. And so we took that guidance. We took white paper that Aaron Pierce and some of the folks at Cyber COE at the time had written and put together a little writing team and got busy in March of 2021. Is that about right?
That takes us up to when we started.
Yeah.
And was there any specific guidance that you got aside from those kind of general officer steering committees or meetings?
No, not really. When we came out of that 3-star information forum, we had a draft white paper. We had the approval on the OE model. We had approval that we would not use the information environment anymore. That's the big difference between the two OE models, is the Army no longer looks at the information environment as kind of a separate thing. We had a draft logic chart that we had worked on from August until probably February that kind of tried to lay out these big ideas in sequence. And then we had a draft taxonomy that supported that logic chart. And I think that's kind of it.
Yeah, that's kind of where we started from. And so part of that draft taxonomy, there were some draft definitions that we started with, definitions for information advantage, definition for information activity. And so it was a very basic framework to begin from, and then we formed the team and started writing, which took us a lot of work just to try to flesh out that framework.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Let's talk about those definitions, the new definitions that you had, because there's a few in ADP 313, and they all kind of have that information word in there. Can you talk through those, Mike?
Sure. So there's probably several definitions that are important to this framework, and we'll start with the definition of information advantage. So information advantage, it's related to the definition of relative advantage, which is a key point in the Army's revised operational concept of multi-domain operations. And so the key aspects of multi-domain operations are using all available capabilities in a combined arms approach to create relative advantages. And a relative advantage is basically a condition or a location in which one force would have the advantage over another. And so what 3.0 further talks about is we can categorize those types of advantages by human, physical, and information. So that brings us to our first term, information advantage. And so information advantage is a condition in which one force holds the initiative over another in terms of understanding, decision-making, and relevant actor behavior. So that's the first definition. And part of it, it's more than just a definition of new terms, is what we've been stressing in the book, as well as in some of the talks like this, is it's not a monolithic one time you have, this force has the information advantage. There are multiple forms of information advantage, just like physical advantage. I mean, we can talk about from a physical perspective, there's range advantage, there's numerical superiority advantage. Well, there's types of information advantages. For example, the threat may be having a very aggressive disinformation campaign and using propaganda, but if our soldiers are resilient and are educated and trained and educated to recognize disinformation and fight against it, that's a form of an information advantage for us. If we can collect information, process, understand, and make decisions faster than the enemy or the threat, that's another form of information advantage. So that's a key term. The other term, I think is pretty key, is this. It's a new term called information activities. And an information activity basically is a collection of tasks for a purpose. It's kind of similar to how we define a warfighting function, but as Chuck already mentioned, we did not adopt information as a warfighting function. Therefore, we use the information warfighting functions, all of them, for an information purpose, and that's where information activities come in. So it's a collection of tasks for a purpose, and then the purposes, we have 5 information activities. The purposes is enable or enhance command and control, protect friendly information and networks, inform audiences, influence, threats, and relevant behaviors, and then lastly, attack, threat, command, and control. So that's another key term that I think is important. So inherent informational aspects of operations. This is not a defined term, but it's a big idea that runs throughout the book. And basically what that is to acknowledge the fact. So it kind of goes back to our definitions of data and information. So we say data is just any signal from the environment. And then information is when a receiver, either human or automated, assigns meaning to that data. And so there's a signal, a human or a machine interprets that signal and assigns meaning to it, and that is information. And so the and this is related to inherent informational aspects of operations. So everything Army forces do, everything we do that can be observed sends a signal. And that's inherent informational aspects, those features of a situation that can be observed. And so we divide those, we categorize them into some different categories like duration, timing, posture. And why this is important is that we, leaders, need to acknowledge the fact that everything we do is going to send some sort of information effect. And so then we need to deliberately plan for those activities, thinking about that they are sending a message and some observers interpreting that. And we want to deliberately, what would be the right word, Chuck? Deliberately get like the best aspects of those as we're planning. So that's another key term, and that's it's again not defined, but it's kind of threaded throughout the book.
I had a question on that. So when I was reading the book, I thought the kind of context clues, like that, middle school term, was kind of what you're getting at with that, with the inherent informational aspects. Is that right? So like, I view something. Let's say this room. There were microphones in this room this morning, so that context clue gave me, hey, we're going to do a recording. Is that kind of where we're going?
No, I think that makes sense, and that's kind of where we're trying to do. So if you think about, and I'm going to give a naval example here, but like we deliberately are sending ships and planes in an area to demonstrate freedom of navigation. But what we got to realize, that's sending signals. So we got to be careful because some of those signals, depending on, say, the size of that demonstration, may indicate that we're being aggressive and potentially an attack. So in that case, we're recognizing the action we're doing, the message we're trying to send, but there's context, as you just were talking about, and so we want to probably avoid sending this message that this is an offensive action. And we can apply that, on the Army side. The difference between, say, a battalion force that's in garrison as opposed to a battalion force that is in a battle position, say, for example, in Korea. So what signals are going to the other side? We got a battalion or brigade in Camp Casey, and now that brigade is in battle positions across the DMZ. Completely different messages, what context is coming from that. So that's kind of how we're using that.
I think the other informational word or term that I found in there was informational considerations. Can you define that?
Yeah, that again is very important, and it's threaded throughout the book. So I don't want to spend a lot of time right now talking about this new model of the OE, but it's related to our revised model of the OE. And so this happened in FM 3.0, but one of the ways, or the way we say we understand the domains of an operational environment, is through three dimensions: human, physical, and information. And the word informational considerations uses those dimensions, human, physical, and information, collectively as a term to help us understand what are the informational considerations in the operational environment. So the definition of informational considerations, and I'm going off the top of my head here, but basically is those aspects of the physical, human, and information domain that affect how humans and automated systems use and act upon information. And so if you look at it, we said physical, human, and informational aspects, and so I'll just walk the dog real quick. So what are the physical aspects that affect how humans and automated systems use and act on information? Well, it's the natural world. So terrain and weather affect communications. Satellite weather affects communications. That's physical, as well as the physical capabilities, radars, computers, etc., that do the exchange of information. So that's the physical aspect. On the human aspect, it gets down to, because information is about communicating, and so communicating between humans, what are the human aspects that we're concerned with? And that is identifying the relevant actors. So there's lots of people involved in operations, but who are relevant? And then kind of get into how do either individuals or groups may think about or perceive and interpret information. And so in that aspect, it's like, what is the culture, some of the biases, perceptions of how humans may receive. And then lastly is the information itself. And it includes like big ideas, what's the narrative, the themes, etc. So when you put all these together, that is informational considerations. And it's an important aspect for us to understand the operational environment, as well as to plan and develop tasks and activities to create an information advantage.
And this relates back to, a lot of folks should be tracking. A couple years ago, we went from MET-TC to MET-TCI. And the I are the informational considerations we're talking about as they relate to the other mission variables. So it's just a reminder, hey, you got to think about these things as you're thinking through mission, enemy, terrain, troops, time, civil considerations, et cetera.
Yeah, and Chuck, that's important because the first time that came out was in our FM50, and which is our planning manual. And then it was formalized. The term was formally defined in FM30. And so that's an important aspect that you're always got to think about. What are those informational considerations, as Chuck just said, in the other mission variables?
I want to go back to when you were talking about information advantage. So you were talking about the combined arms approach. So I have a couple of questions with that. First, could you talk all of the people, the entities that you collaborated with? And then was that intentional for you to have this brand new publication kind of feel familiar with that combined arms approach?
The short answer is yes. There's a reason that they gave this particular ADP to the Combined Arms Center to write, rather than one of the other centers of excellence. And part of our task was to ensure it had a combined arms flavor. What nest us with FM30 and the new ideas in 3.0, the two big things that nest us, the two big ideas are combined arms and then positions of relative advantage. And so that's what we wrote to. We write to, how you employ a combined arms approach to generating information advantages. And the team was almost Army-wide. When we kicked this thing off in March of 2021, I think we had 30 folks or so from 17 different organizations across the Army, cyber COE, space folks. We had the Army Cyber Institute up at West Point. We had the Intel COE. We had our cyber involved. There was a lot of folks that didn't just start out. Planning Darwinism kicked in eventually, and we lost, several people, but we had a core group of probably 10 people that stuck it out to the end, and I'll forever be grateful to them for getting through to it. And you're right, the combined arms approach. I think one of the things that makes this different than the old IO is IO was essentially about integrating what was formerly known as information-related capabilities together into operations. This is about integrating all available capability, from the various warfighting functions into an operation to create an effect. So it's not being put together in some type of information operations working group and then try to integrate into a larger operation. All the capabilities that are available are integrated throughout across the staff and throughout operations. You got anything, Mike?
Yeah, I agree with you, Chuck, and I'll just go back just a little bit. to what you said is there was a conscious decision of who would write this book. And so you talked about a little bit earlier that a lot of this started, in the information community, and you talked about cyber COE doing a force mod analysis, and they wrote a good bulk of the initial information paper about what this would be. But if you remember, one of the big decisions was who's going to write this book. And so cyber COE, and nothing against them at all, but I mean, they had a vision and they thought they should write it. Some other folks thought maybe it should be the information operations proponent because, some people thought this was just kind of a revision to IO. And I think it really was Mr. Creed's vision. And Mr. Creed is our director of CADD. And, he argued that first and foremost, and you mentioned this, Chuck, this book needs to be about information. How, from a military context, how we use it, through all warfighting functions, et cetera. So that's first and foremost. And then, as you said, the other was this combined armed nature. And so who better to write that? Because here at the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, we write Combined Arms Doctrine. And so you write 6.0, Command and Control, ADP, and it's all about integrating and synchronizing the warfighting functions. So we have a lot of experience on this. And so our core team and our director spent a lot of time on this. So I call Mr. Creed part of our core team. But, he was an armor officer, Deputy G3 Brigade Commander. Jesse Bell, Lieutenant Colonel Bell, artilleryman, was a planner at a Corps and NATO and UCOM. I'm an infantry guy, division planner, JTF, and then you working at the Battlefield Coordination Detachment, as well as all your time you had at Mission Command Training Program. I mean, so our core team has a lot of experience in integrating various activities into the concept of the operation. But what we don't have is the detailed experience on the particular specialties. Public affairs, PSYOP, cyber, knowledge management, name them. And so we kind of orchestrated, but those folks provided the expertise. And I think that's the goodness of this book, because now we can think from a maneuver fires perspective, concept of the operations perspective, but then we can pull, those guys were providing the input that pulled all this stuff together. So go ahead, Chuck.
Right, and so because that's kind of a fairly disparate group of ideas, when you talk about kind of the traditional information folks, they worked with us to try to fit. You don't start to see the gaps until you start to look at it holistically, and we did have to modify some things and make some arguments and get buy-in from some folks on tweaking models that are out there. The other big thing is the feedback we got from the Army when we staffed this out. That was huge. This thing went through the first Army. It went through 2 complete Army-wide staffings and then 1 general officer level staffing. The first Army-wide staffing generated over 2,000 comments, which is huge, in our world. The general officer staffing that we ran, kind of special staffing we ran later in 2021, generated another 600 or so as we kind of revised chapters, and then I think we had another 1,000+ comments on the second Army-wide staffing. So the Army has seen this, and the Army's voted, and a lot of the writing in there reflects their suggestions and how they think this would work, especially at echelon, at lower tactical echelons. I think a lot of people, when they hear a lot of the capabilities are employed like in support of a joint force command or specialized capabilities. They aren't always available at the tactical level. When we talk about the attack line, a lot of people think cyber. Well, that's not necessarily going to be the case at Corps and below. But if you put command and control as a high payoff target, then you are actually kind of working the attack line into operations. So again, the feedback from the field and the input from this kind of good writing team that we had over really a 2-year period of time to get this thing done.
I like to dive into the information advantage logic chart or a framework. That's a big part of this publication. So could you start talking about the framework? Tell the listeners what the important highlights are.
So we kind of talked about it a little bit already, but the logic chart, the framework starts with the big idea of multi-domain operations. And I talked about this already, that the forms of relative advantage, information advantage is one of those forms. And so here's where the logic chart really gets in there. So we're seeking an information advantage, and we talk about the way in which we can organize and do that is through 5 information activities. And I've already defined what an information activity is. And so we have 5 information activities, and I'll talk about them just in a little more detail than I did in the past. So the first activity is enable. And the best way to think about what are the tasks and subtasks inside of enable, think of command and control and intelligence. All of intelligence and command and control is designed to, which the purpose of this is to enhance the ability of the commander to understand, decide, and act, or enhance command and control. So this first activity, its purpose, enhance command and control. I mean, if you think about it, conducting the operations process, which is what we talk about, and the integrating processes to facilitate understanding and decision making, that's part of this activity. So that's a little different if someone was thinking purely like information operations. So probably the enable information activity is the biggest difference, but it's not really new because we did command and control and intelligence, but we're accounting for it because we have to account for the friendly aspect of getting an information advantage, not just solely focused on the threat or protecting our information. The next one is the protect information activity, and the purpose of that activity is to protect friendly data, information, and networks. And so I'll talk a little bit about the combined arms flavor of this. Some may think from an informational perspective, when we talk protect, immediately in their minds they might think defensive cyberspace operations, operational security, and those type of things, which yes, those are part of the task we need to do to protect. But here's how we expand it, and this gives it a little maneuver approach. In offense and defense operations and stability, we always are conducting security operations, and those are conducted by Combined Arms Force. And the purpose of security operations, besides providing early warning, is to defeat enemy reconnaissance. So counter-reconnaissance is a big part of protecting our information. The enemy is conducting reconnaissance, whether it's technical or through UAVs or through personnel. They are seeking information on us. So a way to protect our information is aggressive counter-reconnaissance to destroy UAVs and defeat enemy reconnaissance. So you see how that flavor is a little different from if you were like at in the old days in an information operations working group. So that's different. Inform, the purpose of that is to maintain trust and confidence in various audiences in the Army and Army activities. And that's divided into 3 primary tasks. Inform internal audiences, which is the Army, inform Army forces to include families and DA civilians. Then the other 2 tasks are externally focused on the U.S. domestic audience and other foreign audiences. What we stress in this activity is it's a commander and leader kind of responsibility, but it's supported by the public affairs. But on the informing internal audiences, informing Army audiences, one of the emphasis we have is using information to motivate and inspire. I mean, why we fight. What's the purpose of why we are fighting? And using that aspect of information internally, as well as keeping folks informed and all those things associated to that. And then the education piece is really educating soldiers and civilians on threat information warfare and the disinformation associated to that, so we could be more resilient in our own force. Next, we have influence. influence is taking advantage of those inherent informational aspects that I talked about earlier, combined with messaging to affect the behavior of the threat, enemy and adversary, as well as other foreign relevant actors. And then the last information activity is attack. And we can think about this more from a physical or technical perspective, but all those tasks associated to affecting the threat's ability to command and control. And we also talk about also affecting their ability to conduct threat information warfare. And so some of these tasks would be involved, and this gives us a combined arms approach as well, range anything from conducting raids and attacks by maneuver forces, conducting fires like surface-to-surface fire, area interdiction, as well as some things that folks would traditionally associate with information such as electromagnetic attack, offensive cyberspace operations, and a couple more. So that one also has got a combined arms flavor to that. So these activities are designed, using all the warfighting functions are associated to them, are designed for a particular purpose to seek information advantages in its various forms. And so that's really like the logic. And then lastly, we tie it all together. When you're doing these things, you need to consider the principles, which is a new idea we introduced, is the principles of information advantage.
Yeah, could you talk through the principles?
ADPs, Army Doctrine publications, are supposed to be about the fundamental principles. You're supposed to have fundamental principles associated with it. We came up with 4. Offensively focused, combined arms, commander-driven, and soldier-enabled. And the first one, offensively focused, really kind of is about taking the initiative. And it acknowledges that any information advantage that you don't seek to gain, you've essentially ceded to an enemy or a threat. So you constantly have to be on the lookout in working to create and trying to maintain these things. A lot of the things Mike talked about already. I want to be able to make better decisions. When it comes to protection, you got to be aware of OPSEC. You got to be aware of some type of deception. You got to work deception in at the lowest possible levels. We've got a huge emphasis on that. We talk about under Inform that you want to have a better narrative, right? Don't wait to react to someone else's narrative. Have a better narrative before you even kick off. And then don't wait too long to respond to things. I think it's a big deal. Commanders can always tell the truth. You don't have to wait for somebody to come down and tell you what the official theme or message is. You can always tell the truth, consistent with OPSEC and some other things out there. So that's the idea behind offensively oriented. We've taught combined arms an awful lot, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but you use almost every available capability out there to create and exploit some of these information advantages. Commander-driven. So we've said that commanders have to visualize and describe how they're going to use information and integrate it in operations. One of the main complaints over the years, and Mike and I have been doing this for quite a while, is that information is always an afterthought. We go write a plan, and then we come back later on and try to integrate information or information effects into it, rather than it's part of an operation or a plan from the beginning. And this is kind of to force that, cause commanders to pay attention to it, and cause the rest of the staff to be involved. And then finally, soldier-enabled. And this gets back to the idea that every soldier has a role in collecting, communicating, and protecting information. And this is especially important today during competition. Soldiers are in contact right now through social media, through their phones. They're vulnerable. There's mis and disinformation that's out there. How are we going to protect them from that? How are we going to correct that? Understanding that, not adhering to light discipline or not worrying about your cover camouflage and concealment, or not worrying about your emissions control level during crisis or large-scale combat can have a serious negative effect on what you're trying to do. And it doesn't take a lot of guys not paying attention. Folks paying attention. It takes 1 or 2 folks not paying attention to where your day can go bad real quick, especially when you're talking cell phones. We have a vignette in there about the personal electronic devices and how they were able to track, like the airfield in Afghanistan. So there's kind of a lot of things like that. But every soldier we expect has to pay attention to this, and we say this is not just for the information people of the world. This is for every Army soldier and civilians, because we post a lot too. We're exposed to a lot of this stuff as well.
I think soldier enabled is probably my favorite of these principles, just because it does put the onus on every single person. But I want to talk more about the commander driven principle. So do you see commanders executing MDMP differently because of this?
There's going to be some slight modifications, but I don't know if this is getting to the topic, but it's associated with information advantage in the sense of, the side that can collect information, analyze it so they understand, to make decisions and to act faster than the threat is a form of advantage. So the MDMP is one of our models, one of our planning models to get to the understanding and decision piece to it. And so we've talked about a combined arms flavor, but also this has kind of a LISCO flavor as well. So one of the things is we got to get faster at this, and so we have to go through the cycle of processing information, analyzing and understanding, and to get a little to get faster. So that's one aspect. Actually, to specifics in like steps of the MDMP and say the orders format, there is some modification. So we're about ready to publish FM50, which is Army Plans and Orders Production. And what we used to have is there used to be in the base order a scheme of information, which basically comes back to the IO idea of how do all these information-related capabilities come together in a scheme. Well, we're not thinking that way anymore. We're thinking about information through the various warfighting functions. So, for example, scheme of fires. So, offensive cyberspace operations and electromagnetic attack is a form of fires. And so, as we think about that, those personnel on the staff that are worried about those two capabilities are going to integrate those things through targeting and the scheme of fires, and then it would be addressed in other attachments in the order. So there's a little bit of effect there. So that's going to change a little bit about when commanders issue planning guidance. And so we know after mission analysis, part of the MDMP, once the commander gets the mission analysis brief, the commander is going to give guidance on by various warfighting functions. And then this point about commander-driven is commanders, when they give guidance, they're going to have to be very specific in giving guidance on the use of information and creating information advantages. And that would be more by warfighting functions as opposed to like a scheme of information. So I don't know if that answered your question. We are having a new FM50 that is in production for its final production. It will affect the MDMP a little bit. One would be planning guidance, and then it affects the op order format a little bit as well. So I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, you just gave a little teaser for.
Okay, a teaser for the new FM50. Okay.
So we just talked the information advantage framework. We also have a joint information framework. Now I know, Chuck, you kind of talked about how we deviated from joint stuff. So I just want a little bit behind the scenes of why you guys came up with the Army information advantage framework instead of using the joint framework.
So the Army was really on board, I think, with the joint framework, probably up until about 2020, maybe even 2021. So it was kind of a surprise when we broke ranks with them. But really, when you look at it, when you do a comparison, and we do a crosswalk in the book, they have 3 tasks that they talk about. And we can crosswalk all 5 of our information activities to those 3 tasks that joint talks about. So we are nested. We're not identical, but we are nested. And that was kind of Army senior leader decisions at the time.
Any other big ideas that I missed that you want to share with the audience?
Just a couple things. Number one, we're just the D. At the same time as we wrote this, there was a huge Army-wide effort that DAMO-SO ran. I mean, there's a DA-XORD, IA-XORD, and a bunch of stuff going on across the OPMIL PF to try to implement this kind of new idea. We've created units early on. We have theater information advantage detachments, which I'm not so sure. I think they're actually doing operations in the information environment, because we do acknowledge in the book that even though the vast majority of the Army forces are thinking in terms of information advantage, we are also the largest contributor to the joint force with specialized capability, and they need to understand those ideas, those joint ideas, and how to integrate into them. So we have units out there. We're updating doctrine as we go along. So this will get inculcated over the next couple of years. Part of what we're doing is things like this are part of implementation, right? So there's several versions of IA out there right now, because this is like a 2 or 2.5 year process. And our version kind of evolved over time as we learned and got feedback from the Army and kind of changed the tasks and the activities or made tweaks to the model. Not everything else did. So there's like several versions of IA out there right now, and I think it depends on which version of the draft you read. So people need to read this. This kind of gives you a taste. You really need to read the book and try to understand it, and at least get the Army on the same page as to what this thing actually is, so we can kind of get a little bit of unity effort behind it. And I just like to thank everyone else that's out there. I got a whole laundry list of people. You talk about organizations that helped out with this. Lee Goodman at the ICO, Scott Farquhar down at the IOP, Marty Buttram down at SOCO, Mark McIntyre down at Cyber, Matt Hunter and Kevin Tanqueray down at our Cyber, Fred Dixon, up at DAMO-SO and his folks, Major Jessica Dawson and Nick Stark up at the Army Cyber Institute. I mean, these were people that did yeoman's work as we were kind of developing this thing. Mike, do you have anything you'd want to say?
I think it's important that we got to read this book. It is the largest ADP. I think we have a little bit over 100 pages. The book, there's a great foreword from General Beagle. I think that's just very solid one-pager that gets to, some of the big ideas. And I love right at the beginning, he says, everything Army forces do, information is central to everything Army forces do. It's the foundation of intelligence, communication, and all human interaction. And that's the start point. And that's kind of where we started from. So that's good. The book's got an introduction and 8 chapters. And so readers, don't skip the introduction, because what the introduction does for you is it's going to talk about reasons why we changed. So some of the things we talked about here already. It's going to summarize the chapters. It has the logic chart in it. But then at the very end, it talks about what are the new terms and what terms have been rescinded. So that's important. And then we talked about the rest of the book, but the framework, and there's a chapter dedicated to each of the information activities. But then there's another chapter that folks should give a hard look to too, and that's integration. And we were talking about that just a little bit ago. But like, how does the Army information framework nest with the joint? And then how would we integrate these activities within the headquarters? So we spent some time talking about planning, preparing, executing, and assessing, how it works within the integrating processes. But it's a different approach, a slightly different approach than in the past. So that chapter 8 is pretty important too. So, but it has been a pleasure. Me and Chuck, we talked earlier that we've been on the C2 team, and we've written doctrine on command and control and our backgrounds, infantry, artillery. But we got this project, and I'm very, I was excited. We got to work with a lot of different folks on a topic that we didn't have the real particulars on many of the pieces to it. But that was the benefit of having this writing team that Chuck talked about, and we really got support from across the Army to kind of pull in a lot of things together. So it's a good effort, and was exciting to do it.
Thanks, gentlemen, for being on the show. And I also have to plug our YouTube channel, because you guys will be doing a video that will give even more information on ADP 313. Just like writing new doctrine is a team effort, breaking doctrine takes a team. Without the crew and special doctrine division here at CADD, we wouldn't be able to bring you this show. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by Captain Wyatt Harper and 29 Pixels. Please don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify podcasts, and follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, Doctrine Digest videos, and publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.